sorry to break it to you, but you might need a new front end drive shaft and not even know it. Alright, so how exactly would you know that you need a new drive shaft? Let me show you. So every time I got out of the vehicle, I would smell this burning grease smell and I couldn't figure out what it was. I thought maybe it was an oil spill. I checked all over the engine bay, checked the floors, and there wasn't any oil being spilled anywhere. And then my friend Chris Chubb, who a lot of you know, he said that he had to replace his front end drive shaft because the boot busted and there's grease being splattered everywhere. And he said, have you checked your drive shaft lately? And then let me show you what I found when I looked underneath. This is what we saw. Look at all that grease that got splattered up there, and that's what was causing that burning smell. Basically, the boot of this had busted open, all the grease had splattered up there, and now it needs to be replaced. So how does something like this even happen? Well, unfortunately, it's just another consequence of getting your vehicle lifted. The stock front end drive shaft that came with your Jeep is just not long enough to support whatever lift you might put on it. The higher you lift your body off the ground, that drive shaft is just too short to reach from the transfer case to the axle, and eventually the boot that's at the end of it will start to have a lot of stress, bust open, and this is exactly what happened here. What's worse is that the stock drive shafts are also not serviceable. Like, you can't just replace the boot, you can't replace the U-joints, you can't re-grease them. When they're done, they're basically done. Now, you can go get another stock drive shaft, but you're just gonna run into the same problem as you did before because they're just not long enough. And stock drive shafts from Mopar are actually more expensive. Now, a lot of guys, when their front end drive shaft takes a dump, they just remove it and don't put it back on because daily driving, you don't need your front drive shaft. But if you plan to go wheeling, off-roading, and you're gonna go into four-wheel drive, you're gonna need it. Actually, even after they've upgraded their drive shaft, sometimes they just keep it off the vehicle and then just put them on when they know they're gonna go wheeling. I don't know, man, I'm not gonna go do that. That's just another thing I have to remember to do before we hit the trails. Speaking of hitting the trails, we are gonna be hitting the trails very soon, so I do need to have my front drive shaft working, and so that is why I am going aftermarket. Not only is this going to be a lot stronger, but it's also going to give me the length I need to support the lift that I have. Now, when it comes to aftermarket drive shafts, there are a ton of different options, and you can go as hardcore with this as you want. It really all depends on how you use your vehicle. If you know you are one of those really hardcore rock crawlers, you're going to probably want something that's even stronger than the one I have here. I am not that guy. I am not getting my vehicle on this kind of weird angles or slamming it into rocks. Like, that's just not something I want to do with the Jeep. So I went with the Adams drive shaft. This is the 1310. It's basically the kind of the low end of the drive shafts that they have. And I don't want to say low end because they're all going to be strong. I mean, a lot stronger than the stock, but it's not going to give you like some of the features that the higher end ones have. All right, so what do you get when you buy an Adams drive shaft? Well, obviously you get the drive shaft itself. You're also going to get the yoke. This yoke replaces the factory flange that's on there now. And then you're going to get the hardware, which comes with Loctite. Very, very important. Unless you want to use Loctite that you already have, one that you're familiar with, but they do provide that for you. They also give you some bolts to mount this thing on with, and these are 12-point bolts, meaning that the heads of them have 12 points. So make sure you have some 12-point sockets. Now, you can skip to any part of this video, but I am asking that you at least pay attention to this segment because there are some important things you need to know. Number one, we talked about these drive shafts being serviceable. When you buy a drive shaft, you have the option of either getting greasable or non-greasable U-joints. Greasable means just that. There's going to be a Zerk fitting on here and you can add grease anytime you want and service it anytime you want. And you might think, well, yeah, that sounds great. I should get that so I can do that. However, having non-greasable, which is what I have here, is actually going to be stronger. It means that all the grease is already all sealed up in here into one piece. Now, just because something is sealed up, it doesn't mean that it's not replaceable. What's great about this is that if this were to bust open and there's grease all over the place again, I don't have to replace the entire drive shaft. I just need to replace the U-joint. This is greasable on the shaft part of it though. On both ends, you're gonna see some Zerk fittings where you can add grease, and that's a good thing because this thing will expand and contract as you drive your vehicle. So you wanna be able to service and grease up that part of it. Number two, when you buy a drive shaft, you also have the option of getting a drive shaft with the flanges already installed or not. Get the drive shaft with the flanges already installed. Trust me, it makes the installation a lot easier. It'll just bolt right up versus having to remove some stuff in the vehicle that's gonna mess with some of the gears, some of the torque specs that are on there, and it'll just make it a long day for you. Make it easy on yourself. Get it with the flanges already installed in your drive shaft, and that way you can just bolt it right up to the factory holes. And number three, and probably the most important thing you need to know is, if you drive an automatic Jeep JK or JL, you can probably go to the Adams website, choose your drive shaft, order it, and you're good to go. But I decided to call them anyway, just to make sure I was getting the right parts. And when they found out that I drove a manual transmission, they said, we actually have to build out your drive shaft for you because the distance from the transfer case to the axle is different on a manual transmission than an automatic transmission. Thank God I found that out, because if I would have just ordered a drive shaft just off their website, it probably would not have fit. It doesn't cost more for them to build you a custom length one. It's gonna cost the same amount, but double check that anyway. So go on their website, they tell you exactly where to measure underneath their vehicle so that they can build out the right size drive shaft for you. Even if you drive automatic, even if you drive automatic, I would double check that anyway before you just order a drive shaft. This costs about 600 bucks. Before you just go and spend that, I would double check first, or even give them a call, let them know what you're looking to do. That way they can build out the appropriate drive shaft for you. But anyway, that's everything you need to know about this drive shaft. Let's go ahead and install it. I will say I'm a little bit apprehensive. Suspension is not really my forte, but they said the only way to learn is to do it yourself. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. You're gonna learn along with me. They say that this is a really easy install, but I don't wanna say that and jinx it. Anyway, let's go and do it.
First thing I did was remove the skid plate. This is optional but highly recommended so you can give yourself some room underneath. Next, I removed all 8 bolts holding the front drive shaft to the transfer case with an 8mm socket. I won't bore you by showing you the removal of all 8 bolts, but just know I had to roll the vehicle back and forth to spin the drive shaft and access the bolts. I also had to switch to a box wrench as the bolts are pretty long and the socket wrench will end up getting stuck, sandwiched between the bolt and the drive shaft. This was the most tedious step to say the least. Moving over to the axle side towards the front of the vehicle, I removed those bolts with a 15mm socket. Those bolts were easier to access, however, they are bolted on pretty tight and was tougher to remove without an impact drill.
Alright, so I finally got the 4 bolts removed from the axle side. That was a pain in the butt. Good news though is that as soon as those bolts came out, the drive shaft just came right off. I was worried I was gonna have to tap it and use a pry bar and try to get it off, but it actually just slid right off. Now I just have to remove it on the other side. Once the drive shaft is out, I'm gonna show you the damage on it just so you can see how it looks like, and then we will continue.
Back to the transfer case side, I was able to remove the drive shaft by tapping it with a rubber mallet. I was so glad it wasn't sticking on this side either.
Alright, so take a look at this drive shaft. You'll see that this whole thing is just already pretty much messed up. This whole rubber boot just is eaten away. All the grease that was in there is gone. I mean, that's where all the grease was before. And this is what I mean by the stock drive shaft not being serviceable. There's no way to remove this and just replace that part. And on the other side, there's no way to remove this U-joint either without, basically you'd have to mill this thing out so you can get to that pin to remove it because it's pretty much stuck on there. So you can't replace this. I mean, you can't even re-grease it. There's no kind of service you can do to this. So I'm really glad we're finally going to replace this thing with a much stronger and serviceable drive shaft from Adams.
Now we have to remove the flange on the transfer case side, as this will be replaced with the yoke. To remove it, first step is to remove the nut, holding it in the middle with a 1 5/16 inch socket. My first attempt, the flange kept spinning with the nut, making it impossible to remove. To stop it from spinning, I engaged 4-wheel drive by going into 4 high. After that, I was able to remove the nut easily. For the flange itself, I had a hard time hitting it with a rubber mallet as it was too large to fit in that area, so I resorted to just using a screwdriver and hammer. If you hit it in certain areas, it will eventually slide right off. Inside the stock flange is a rubber O-ring. Remove it and transfer it to the new yoke. Now take that yoke and slide it back onto the transfer case, then bolt it in place with the nut we removed earlier. Make sure it's nice and tight. To mount the new drive shaft, I started on the axle side. I lined up the 4 holes and reused the old bolts we removed earlier. The 4 bolts already have thread locker on them, but it's always a good idea to add more and refresh them. I didn't tighten these bolts completely yet. Back to the transfer case side, I had to wriggle it around and extend the shaft a bit until the U-joint sat in the yoke, and then I got the 4 bolts started. Don't forget to use thread locker before bolting them in. This time the bolts will come in from the rear, which makes it more difficult to torque. Take the vehicle off 4-wheel drive so that the shaft can spin, and then, like before, roll the vehicle back and forth to get to each bolt. Once I got all 4 bolts started, I tightened them up with a 12.8mm or 5/16" socket or box wrench. You'll need to torque all 4 bolts to 18 foot-pounds. With the transfer case side tightened, I went back to the axle side and tightened up those 4 bolts, and I was finished.
I really need an impact wrench. Simple, but painful install. And that's not an exaggeration. I must have injured myself like a few times. There was one time where I was just trying to get the bolts out and my hand slipped and it banged up against something else and my knuckles got all messed up. Then there was another time where I was holding on to my wrench and trying to pull, and the socket flew off the bolt and I went sliding and I scratched my shoulder up on the pavement. There were a couple of just sore joints and even my neck because I had to crane a lot. All signs of getting old, man. I mean, the process itself really couldn't be any easier. It's just a couple of bolts that's holding that drive shaft in place. Once you get those bolts out, that old drive shaft will come right out. Then you put the new drive shaft back up and then you put the bolts back in its place and you are good. It's just really tedious. Like trying to get to those bolts can be a pain. On the axle side, those 4 bolts, and there's only 4 of them, they're really in there. I really need an impact wrench. Now on the transfer case side, that was a pain in the butt because there are 8 bolts there. Trying to get to all 8 bolts meant that I had to take my vehicle and just roll it back and forth and back and forth and back until and forth. Each of those bolts lined up to an area where I could clear it. Then I took my socket wrench and then kind of took them all out. But I am super happy that I now have a much beefier and much stronger and much robust front drive shaft than I had before. Now, they do give you a warning, actually, hold on. On some models with an aftermarket drive shaft, especially on 2-door model JKs, TJs, and YJs, you might notice a slight vibration on or off the gas. This could be due to the pinion angle being set to the factory specs and not set correctly. Should that occur, in most cases, you will just need to adjust the pinion angle according to your setup. I drove it around the neighborhood and I did not get any kind of vibrations, which is awesome. And I think the reason why I wasn't getting any vibrations, one, I have a 4-door vehicle, and at the same time, we've already kind of addressed a ton of the geometry issues I've had since getting the lift. And I think because we addressed a lot of the geometry issues, I wasn't getting any of these vibrations from the pinion angle. But not everything is good news. While I was down there replacing the drive shaft, I saw that there was oil everywhere. So I have an oil leak somewhere. So I did my detective work, kind of looked around to see where it was originating from, and it looks like, I'm hoping, that it's coming from the oil cooler. You can tell because you can pop the hood and then where your oil filter housing is, shine a light down there, and if you see a pool of oil in there, then that's probably your oil cooler leak, which I found out tends to break a lot on the Jeep. I'm really hoping that it's something that can be fixed as soon as possible, because next week, if you're from the South, you already know that next weekend is the Southeast Adventure Vehicle Expo, or SAVE, and I am going to be there along with Overlanderoos, Sunshine State Adventure Company, and Sunshine State Vikings. We have a booth, and I really, really want to be there. I do not want to miss that. I want the Jeep to be there. If you're going, come by and say what's up. I would love to meet you. We would love to meet you and chat it up with you. So we will be there. Hopefully you guys come through, and if you do, come say what's up to us. All right, but before I go, last video I did sort of some unboxings for you guys. I'm gonna kind of do that now. Only a couple of things, don't worry, it won't take long, but some stuff came in the mail today. First, from Arcade. I am a big fan of Arcade belts. Like, I've been buying their belts for like a long time, and then I was super surprised when they just reached out to me and say, hey, you wanna do a collab video or try out our belts? I'm like, oh my God, I didn't reach out to them. They reached out to me. So we're gonna talk about camp clothing in another video, but I just wanted to show you the two belts that they sent me. They look pretty cool. It's usually not really my flavor with this kind of color scheme, but I bet you I can make it work. And then what I'm really excited about is Midland is like killing the game right now. They sent me their new antennas that are not even being sold yet. I mean, you need to see how massive this thing is. So this is their new GMRS antenna. Okay, so it comes up from the floor to like right here to me. I've always loved the look of these beefier antennas, but they never had anything like that for GMRS. For CB radios, they have it, but now they have one for GMRS that I think is gonna look really awesome on the Jeep. They actually sent me two. They sent me this one, and then they sent me a much shorter one. So this is their shorter one. I might put the shorter one on the Forerunner. But we're gonna do a video on these very, very soon. I wanna get them on the Jeep like tomorrow so that I can have this for the expo. These look so awesome. But anyway, that's it. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and also consider supporting us on Patreon so we can continue to make more content like this. And as always, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Baptism Overland. My name is Asia Sampson, and I will see you next time. Oh, crap.